Great pleasure to start the second session, which is a keynote for the conference Mobile Heritage, arranged by the network One by Walking. And I wish everyone in the room here a good welcome back, and also a big heartful welcome to everyone that's following us on the stream. And we will launch directly into our keynote, which is a double act. And we're very, very happy that Daniel Svensson and Katarina Saltzman agreed to come here to present on their interesting research on walking heritage. And Daniel is an associate professor in sports science at Malmö University. He's also one of these people that actually practices what he preaches. So he's also a very keen athlete and really uses his own insights in his work as well from being a practicing sports person. Katarina Saltzman is associate professor at conservation, the University of Gothenburg. She's done a lot of research into the nature-culture relations from an ethnological perspective. And personally, I have to say, I learned about Katarina's work on in-between spaces back in 2009. And since then, I've been religiously following everything she does because it's so exciting. She's done a lot of work lately on the cultural heritage of garden spaces. And now they're here together to give a presentation on movement heritage, paths as links both between history and a sustainable future. So please give a big hand for Daniel and Katarina. Very welcome here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne, for the introduction, and it's an honor and a privilege for us to be here to give this keynote. I think all lectures here will be key, but we'll do our best anyway. Thanks especially to you, the organizers, but also to all the One by Walking community and everyone who's here.
And thank you also to Hanna Holmen for hosting this conference. We are so happy to be here.
Yes.
And we were also very happy to hear the presentations in the previous session, which really opened up the discussion about movement and heritage in also spiritual ways. I think our presentation will be a bit more focused on hands-on aspects of path and heritage, but we'll see where we go.
Yes, there is a poem, so don't worry.
Okay, a few words. Susanne already introduced us, so just about our way here. Daniel is the historian. I'm the ethnologist. That's where we started. We have been doing research together with Sverker Sörlin, who has been leading the project that we have been collaborating in. We need to mention his name in this context. And he has played a key role, of course. Together, the three of us hosted a workshop some years ago during the pandemic.
Yes.
Which led to a book called Pathways, where a number of people present here in the room made excellent contributions. So we just edited the volume.
Yes, and we have sort of worked with this concept throughout our shared project and also a bit before that. And it's been also influenced a lot by the work in the One by Walking context. But we will use it again today. So movement heritage, as we have sort of come to loosely define it, a distinct kind of cultural heritage that is dependent on continuous use or memory work to remain. So we have both the sort of the practical, physical aspects, but also the immaterial aspects. It's significant, but small scale. It's leading beyond the traditional way of dividing things, the nature-culture divide, also the immaterial and immaterial. And it can also show us ways towards sustainable uses of landscape through historical examples.
And you have already seen a few pictures of paths, and you will see more in this presentation.
And that's Sverker Sörlin in the picture, actually. Somewhere in the
Tiny
picture.
figure. Yeah. We will really focus on the matter of path, and what is a path? What makes a path? And here comes the poem.
Yes, so we've been using small parts of this poem in a few occasions now, but here's a longer chunk of it, and we thought it would fit nicely for this presentation. So it's a poem by Lars Gustafsson, Ballad on the Paths in Västmanland. So I'll just read it out for you. The whole point of being a path, that it has been done before. Who made the path? Charcoal burners, fishermen, women with skinny arms collecting firewood, outlaws, timid and grey as the moss, still in their dream with the fratricide blood on their hands. Autumnal hunters in the wake of trusty foxhounds with their frost-clear bark. All and none of them. We make it together. You too make it on a windy day when it is early or late on earth. We write the paths, and the paths remain, and the paths are wiser than we are, and know all we wanted to know.
So, maybe this opens up a bit for questions like this one. How often do you need to walk on a path for it to remain? Some paths are very, very old, others are quite recent, but they need to be walked on, at least occasionally, to remain as paths. I don't know what your thoughts are on this matter. I would say that it depends. Of course, it depends on the kind of terrain, the climate, the vegetation of the area where the path is passing through, how the surrounding land is maintained, as in this case in a forest. How is the forest managed or not? And are there others, other humans, other non-humans who are using the path? That's often the case. That, of course, matters for the continuous life or existence of a path. But you can also stress the part of the question to remain. What does it really mean for a path to remain? Even if a path has almost disappeared, and it's really hard to find out there somewhere, it could still remain in the sense that it's imprinted in people's memories, that people know where this path used to be. Maybe also others than people. It may, of course, also be documented in different ways and kept in archives or in collections of photographs or maps by private owners or public collections. And based on memories of different kinds, it can be possible to restore, rediscover, and start using an old path again. To some extent, perhaps the path remains as long as there is someone holding memories of it.
And we will talk about paths as a sign of landscape use, in a way, a sign of different ways of being with and in nature or the landscape or whatever you want to call it. Also a good way of entering into history, I would say, and looking at historical ways of doing things, historical knowledge, historical patterns of movement. And it becomes interesting also to compare with other forms of footprints that we make that are more large scale. So these are two pictures from West Sweden, outside the city of Borås, a place called Viared, which up until the 1960s looked a bit like on the picture to the left, quite small scale farming and a lot of dirt roads and paths across the fields. And today it looks as in the satellite image to the right. So it's an industrial area, it's a logistics park with huge buildings and huge roads and not so many paths. So there it's a struggle to remember or rediscover the paths, because they are to some extent no longer there.
Well, while in some cases paths may have transformed into roads over a historical process, maybe in some cases also into motorways, there are also, of course, still paths and motorways existing at the same time, sometimes side by side or crossing, as in this picture, also not far from Borås, on the motorway in between Gothenburg and Borås. Even though I suppose most walkers prefer to keep a distance from the big infrastructure environments such as this one. It's also part of the picture that the paths are part of the present.
Indeed, and maybe also the potential of keeping paths even in this type of very different society from the ones where they emerged, but also as a sign of that new practices and new paths may emerge today as well. We have tried to distinguish a bit between paths and trails, and the idea behind that is to highlight sort of the level of adaptations or the level of surrounding work that is needed. So we have said something like that a path is something that is a result of walking, that emerges from walking, while a trail is a more managed thing that you implement to make people walk there. That you want people to start walking, then you build a trail, while a path is slightly more organic, bottom up. So that's the kind of a distinction we have elaborated on or worked with during the project.
Yeah. And in our project we have been looking at, well, both paths and trails, and among the trails we have been examining. There are quite a few that are located close, rather close to the urban centers in western Sweden. Some parts of them are almost sort of part of the urban fabric, like paved walking routes that transform into a path into the forest. So that's one kind of trails that we have been looking at.
Yeah, and this is one example. We will go into it more, but when you speak of a trail, you can sort of it becomes logical to have something like this. It says this is the Finn Forest Trail in between West Sweden and Eastern Norway. There's a Finnish connection here as well. We will explain that more soon. But this is a trail. It's built on old paths, really old paths. But as a trail, it can sort of be inaugurated at a specific date. It's official opening it's in 1992. So that's when the trail is opened. But when do you open a path? This goes far from major cities, so it's in a forested area, it's quite sparsely populated, and it's in an area where there was a lot of immigrants from Finland coming there, and the culture that they brought and the imprints that they made on the landscape is still very present, both like the physical imprints but also the cultural ones, if you can separate those, I don't know. But the paths are a very important aspect of this area. It's very few roads there, and the ones that are there are very small. So it's still like, to get around, you need the paths, and this culture can hardly be understood without actually knowing about the paths and the practices that made the paths. And this is indicated also by Carl Axel Gottlund, who was himself walking around in the area and collecting the stories and talking to the people of the Finn Forest. And one of his books is actually explicitly about his walks around the Finn Forest. So that's really present in the whole culture. And the Finn Forest Trail then that we saw on the map on the other picture, it's an attempt to combine sort of this regional history, this cross-border history between Sweden and Norway and Finland, with outdoor recreation, with tourism, also with regional development of different kinds in an area that has, at least in parts of history, struggled a bit in terms of finding new jobs, for example. So there's a lot of things coming together in this area, and the paths are at the center of it.
Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the heritage aspect of paths and trails. If you think about a heritage path or a heritage trail, or use that concept, usually or traditionally, conventionally, that tends to mean a path or a trail connecting heritage sites. You go from one site to another, and typically there would be signposts telling you where to stop and have a special look at something that is worth looking at, where there is history present that you can explore, and especially through looking at it. This sign in the picture, that's a rather old sign. I guess it could be seen as heritage in itself. It's put up by the regional authorities in western Sweden, Länsstyrelsen, the county administrative board, that tells that here you are standing close to an archaeological burial ground, and it's important information for the walker to know this, and to have to be able to stop and watch it. Actually, it was quite hard to see the tomb itself,
Yeah.
but the sign was there, showing that this here we have heritage. So that's sort of a typical way of thinking about heritage in relation to paths and trails. And also to think that heritage, what to regard as heritage, that's something that is defined by, well, maybe not always by authorities, such as this county administrative board, but at least by experts. And here we are inspired by Laura Jane Smith, who has written an excellent book with a critical, takes a critical stance towards this authorized heritage discourse in the book Uses of Heritage. And I guess we are thinking that there is more to heritage in relation to path than this kind of sites. Along the path, there are, in the small scale and the large scale, many signs of processes of change, many reminders of the fact that we are ourselves also in a constant process of change on the short term and in the long term. Along the path there is also always landscape history present, and many signs that you could read in the landscape itself. Now I'm not talking about signposts, but signs in the landscape. Such as, for example, this pile of stones in the forest that tells that this has not been a forest for that long. It has been open land. It has been used for agricultural purposes. Someone has been collecting these stones, probably. And this, and of course, there is also a very blurred boundary here between what we call nature and what we tend to call culture. So what if we regard the paths themselves as heritage? I mean, they are indeed constantly being made and remade, perhaps particularly in a case like this. This is actually a trail, of course, where it's a built structure, but they are also made through collective decisions and actions by many people and others, sometimes together. There is an everyday maintenance going on to keep the paths remaining. Maintenance, care, repair, and of course not least the paths are made and remade by being walked upon. There are also typical signs of heritage, that of a walking heritage that many people recognize, such as these markers for winter trails. I don't know how universal they are, but they are very typical in the Scandinavian context. These crosses that mark that this is a trail that is used. In this case, this is from Vålådalen. Many of you probably recognize it from our previous workshop. But this is used both in summer, but also in winter as a skiing track.
It becomes very iconic, like in a Scandinavian context. I was thinking about the flags, for example, colored flags. It's a similar thing, I would guess. People know what it means when they see them.
And perhaps when we think about the paths and the trails as heritage, we could perhaps also move it one step further and think about the movement along those tracks as heritage. And this goes hand in hand, I would say, with the current developments within heritage research, with the critical heritage studies, where heritage is today seen very much as something that is done in the present, where heritage is understood as meaning-making practices, something that we do today for the future, rather than something just remaining from the past. Okay, so moving from sites to movement, it's also we have our concept movement heritage. We could also talk about movement as heritage. This is a picture from our previous workshop in Vålådalen, where we see one example of the fact that, of course, there are ways of moving that are regarded as heritage, also with a quite traditional understanding of heritage, such as this slow Japanese walking technique, Suriashi, that Ami Skånberg showed and tried to learn, many of us, during the workshop in Vålådalen. It was a beautiful experience. But maybe we can also regard other ways of moving and movement as heritage. And Daniel will talk more about this.
Yes, so coming from history in a way, but also from sports science, I am intrigued by historical ways of training, ideas about training, and how you have used and how you can use the landscape and paths and trails for training in different ways. And in this context, I would specifically want to highlight this idea about natural training. It's something that's very, very present in Vålådalen, but it's not only there, of course. You can find a lot of other examples. I'll say that the basic idea behind natural training is to use the existing landscape as it is for training, rather than adapting it to make training better. So it's of course about performance, but it's not how the landscape performs as a tool for sports in a way. It's about how you can adapt to the existing landscape. And in Vålådalen, it's Gösta Olander who is the key person. He wrote a lot about this and other things, and he was also coaching elite athletes who came to Vålådalen to train there. And there are other examples as well. Percy Cerruti is one who had this idea about combining the Stoic and the Spartan. So his philosophy was called Stotan. And it's strikingly similar to Olander's ideas about how to be natural, train natural, be connected to the place and do your training sort of with nature rather than somewhere else, excluded from nature. And this quote is from Gösta Olander, his book about training advice for cross-country skiers, where he wrote that our Lord has, through a grand and varied nature, given us the best training ground. So nothing that we attempt to build or construct will ever measure to the training ground that we have already been given. So that's why he advocated for using these paths in the mountains as a base for your training. And on the picture you see Swedish elite runner Dan Van being coached by Olander in Vålådalen in the 1960s. And this tradition goes way back. It was not invented by Olander and Cerruti. It was, if you go back to the early days of doing conscious training for sport reasons, this is very much what it was about, I would say, at least for sports, outdoor sports, the traditional sports such as running or swimming. But we have seen this gradually change. So in sports science, we talk about sportification, how sports become more and more sports, so to say. They become more and more regulated, and equipment becomes more and more specialized. You do training that is more and more directed towards performance in that actual sport, rather than any general endurance training or strength training. It has changed the impact that sports has. It has changed sports, but also the impact of sports on the land. So if paths used to be the infrastructure of sport performance in endurance sports, they are now to some extent replaced by indoor facilities and test labs and home gym equipment that you can connect, and you do virtual training online, which is different than what this natural training concept is, and it's less reliant on paths. So sportification has changed sports' relation to paths, I would say. And it has become more and more rationalized. We've seen a shift from natural training, which you can, of course, problematize this idea of naturalness, but we see something really different today in terms of how training is conducted, and it has happened partly because of the scientific influence on sports and training and how you want to maximize the outcomes of training in a physiological sense, how you want people to do specific forms of training that raises the pulse and that gives the types of benefits that you associate with endurance training or recreational walking as well. That you want to construct a training landscape that is sort of making people behave in a certain way, which is the most rational way to behave if you want these kinds of effects from a physiological point of view. So instead of using the trails or the paths that have traditionally been used, you build these kinds of motionsspår, like these endurance tracks, especially designed where you take the car and you go there and you do your running and you take a sauna and then you go back. So this is like the Swedish welfare state, the sport aspect of it, based on physiological research. And it's part of the rationalization of sport and society in general. And Mattias Kviström has labeled these types of landscape portable landscapes, which is that they are not connected to any specific place, but you can sort of it's a design that you can place anywhere, really. So it's maybe, in a way, the opposite to movement heritage. But these also, of course, with time, also take on. They connect to the place they're in, so they're not placeless forever. But this is part of the, let's call it indoorization. So a word in use in sports science, but maybe you could, to connect to the earlier presentations, you could also call it disenchantment of sports, of training. Sports moving indoors, because you want predictable conditions, it's outdoor skiing to the left, and it's uncertain, the weather can change, anything can happen, which will make it hard to compare one training session to the next. But if you're indoors in the Torsby ski tunnel, for example, it's always the same temperature, the same snow, you know what to expect, you can compare from year to year, from training to training. It's more rational in a way, it's more predictable, comparable, measurable. And that's sort of the direction that sport has moved in.
And you have written about that.
Yes, in this book, Sport Performance and Sustainability. So what does this do to the potential of sustainable sports on an individual level, but also on a more societal level, a global level? And this is another concept from sports science, contextual sport, which basically connects to the natural training idea that many sports emerge from a geographical context. So you ski where there's snow, you surf where there are waves and oceans, skate where there are frozen lakes and so on. But that is less and less relevant today because of the possibilities that we have to create these circumstances indoors. And so postmodern sports are in a way decontextualized, they're indoorized, they are virtualized, they are not so contextual anymore. This contextual sport is from Brian Wilson and Brad Millington. But paths still have practical and emotional qualities. They are still very important in sports in different ways. When you talk to athletes, they rarely praise their indoor virtualized sessions in the gym, but rather their favorite paths that they are training in their everyday training. So maybe we can recontextualize sports and training through paths. Yes, so this is a definition. We had promised to talk about sustainable development as well, and this connects to that. And this is a definition on sustainable sports. Sport is sustainable when it meets the needs of today's sporting community while contributing to the improvement of future sport opportunities for all. And this is important, I think, and the improvement of the integrity of the natural and social environment on which it depends. So moving by foot along a path is a fairly sustainable mode of transport and of training and of leisure. So can our ecological footprint be reduced by making actual footprints on the ground?
So I guess we are approaching the time when it's time to wrap up,
Yes.
and we return to the concept movement heritage, and try to see what sort of signifies a movement heritage. And we have talked a bit now about landscapes that are in different ways shaped by how they are used, from the tiny little path that was used by few or many people to the portable landscapes of the endurance tracks, etc. We have touched on, without mentioning the words, the horizontal and vertical aspects of path and trails. And by this we mean that, there are horizontal qualities of paths in the sense that they lead from one point on the earth to another. But at the same time, of course, there is a vertical, historical connection of the path, in the path, of the use of the path to the past.
Yeah, and also the circular dimension that we learned about in the previous session.
Yeah, that's true. The traces of mobility that are of different kinds that sort of inscribe the movement along the paths and trails as heritage. And we have also talked about these features in the landscape as quite discrete infrastructures. They are not that they don't make a big thing of being there. They are just there, ready to be used, but needing to be used in order to remain. When we have been working with these matters, these sort of quite everyday landscapes and features in the landscapes, and ever-changing heritage of paths, we have sometimes stopped to wonder a bit. So why is this so important? And also, Susanne, you mentioned that I have also been working with the similar perspectives in relation to gardens, garden heritage. And I have asked myself the same question in that context, especially today when we are in a situation with conflicts, war in Europe, sort of a more critical surrounding situation than we used to have. And then it's easy to think that, well, heritage, maybe we first of all need to protect the monuments after all. I mean, now in a critical situation. Maybe it's sort of too luxurious to think about walking paths and gardens and such pleasant everyday things as heritage. Maybe that's sort of not serious enough. And we have been discussing this a bit, but we kind of ended up thinking that maybe it's even more important to safeguard the everyday and the ever-changing, the small scale, the things that are close to our hearts and our daily practices in situations where there is where our livelihood and our the conditions we are used to have are threatened in different ways. At least that's one discussion we have had in our group.
Yeah, and it's in a way more bottom up, as we said before, more democratic, and something that connects us all, as you said before, Danny, as well, with this being in someone else's shoes. Almost everyone has experiences of paths and can have fond memories of walking a specific path. So even if we have different paths, we can sort of identify with each other in that sense. Yes, we should wrap up now, but this is the final slide. So as a sports person, this is my way of trying to be slightly more intellectual than I actually am. But this is a philosophical dilemma. So about the ship, originally the ship of Theseus, but basically you could ask the same about the path. When does a path cease to exist? The idea about the ship is that it's an old ship, the ship of Theseus, and and it's breaking down, and you exchange one piece of it at a time. And at what point does it cease to be the Theseus ship? When is it a new ship, or does it ever cease to be the Theseus ship? And where is the ship? Is it in the material parts, or is it somewhere else? And yeah, I think it could be helpful to think about paths in that way as well. Like, how can we think about the relations between the material and immaterial paths? What would it mean to consider paths and trails as heritage, as profound aspects of being human? And what parts of it are unmissable and cannot be exchanged?
So, thank you.
I need to break. I think I need to use one of these. If it's. I think.
Give you a hand, just
Yeah.
a moment.
Yeah.
Was there a question in
Yes.
the public?
We-
Are there any questions?
We can already. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Always so fascinating and so rich, this project. It's we're so happy that you could come here and talk to us. And we have already questions in the audience.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the really insightful, wonderful presentation. I have a question for each of you, and first for Katarina. Last year there was a new element included in the UNESCO representative list for intangible cultural heritage, transhumance, or transhumance paths, the seasonal movement of people and livestock across geographic or climatic regions. And I was wondering if that is close to what you intend for paths and trails being considered as heritage.
Certainly,
Yes.
certainly, yes, definitely, and especially as it's a combination of people and animals using the path, and there are long historic traditions, but also, I mean, it's necessary that they are ongoing, these traditions, for these paths and the traditions themselves to continue.
What kind of heritage communities would you collaborate in order to make path and trails as heritage, or to consider path and trails, as heritage?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it depends a lot on the local situation or the regional situation. I mean, we have been, some of the trails we have been exploring during our projects, there have been local communities and associations active in maintaining those paths and trails. And that's one example, like hembygdsförening.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have a good translation for that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
the
local heritage
or historical
associations. Yeah.
associations. Yes.
I think it's a very good question because it highlights, I think, this democratic potential in it. That it's
Yes.
there's so many actors that could be involved, that could have a stake in being part of using and preserving paths. So depending on where you are, but sport clubs, these other associations and or in specific places, like we were in the Swedish mountain region for parts of this project, and there it was a lot about the Sami paths and the reindeer herding practices and so on. So in the Pathways book we have a lot of examples. We have from Åland, we have from Belgium, from the workers. So it's so many different groups or parts of society that could be involved.
Thank you. Can I ask a question to Daniel too? Or is it? So we read your work, but for now, what do you think about well-being in contextualized sports? As opposed to well-being in decontextualized sports settings.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's probably quite individual, but if I should dare to answer anyway, I think it was at least more present in these ideas of contextual sport, of natural training, than it was in the more rationalized, more physiology-based training guides that you would read in the 1950s, 1960s. So I think we have maybe started to reintroduce this more holistic approach, even in a scientific way, in terms of like sport psychology and mindfulness practices. So it's there's no escaping that dimension, I would say. But for a time it was sort of brushed aside a bit.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks for the question.
Yes, Daniela.
Thanks for the presentation. There are two questions I would like to ask you. One is a bit silly, one maybe a bit less. So the first one, would be you talk a lot about how path and trails they are not the same. I remember a discussion during the workshop for the book, very interesting. And also how different usage, right to land, also like have a lot of influence in which kind of path we want to preserve and which not. And when it comes to heritage, it's always political and cultural at the same time, and so it's always debatable. But my question would be, what kind of path you don't want to preserve? You wouldn't want to preserve.
Yeah.
And this I don't know. Can I also ask the second one? It has to do with etymology. So I was thinking the word sport, I think, comes from deport in French, which means like to have fun, to kind of a playful activity, which normally has to do with the outside. But I know in a Nordic language, it is completely different. I have no idea where it comes from. To me, it reminds me of water, because hydros, I don't know. So can you tell me where it comes from, and what is maybe the cultural meaning of it, if it's different from the English sport? Thanks.
Yeah, two good questions. I don't know, should we start with paths or?
Maybe just shortly about the first question. I have to think about that one, but maybe you have a suggestion.
Yeah. That's mean. Just throw it back.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, this came to my mind when you were mentioning about ruination and change, because that's part of what happens when places are not either curated or managed or used or practiced. Maybe that's the best word. And sometimes it's just is just right because there the sign, the marks of how people or animals or the weather interact with the place, and so it's fine not to preserve anything. I come from a country when we preserve everything, everything literally, and we don't even have the money to do it actually. And I will say something about that also when it comes to cultural and political meaning of it, which is less fun. And then maybe I was thinking about the military traits, which are important, I think, to remember to many extent. But to some other extent, I don't know if I want to remember a place just for a military action. It kind of takes a lot of place and erases some kind of everyday life, lay, use, and practices. I was thinking about that while traveling to Norway this summer, actually. In the north of Norway, is all about the resistance against the Nazi, which is good, important. But what about what happened before that? So,
That's a very good reflection, and that's part of this. The different dimensions of the past, different layers, if you want. That on sometimes in history, like one layer or one specific part of history can be very dominant, which blurs all of the other imprints. So I think it's important to remember that a lot of paths have been made for a long time and by many different people.
And for sure, it's not an overarching goal to protect every path. I mean, you can make a path in a summer just crossing a lawn, and if the life pattern changes in some ways, it disappears. But I mean, as long as it has importance for someone to remember something or to do something, then it plays a role.
Yeah, and the sport, that's also a very good comment. So we use sport in Sweden and in Scandinavia as well, but we also have this the idrott concept, which is a more traditional concept, I would say, and more about. So, for example, esports is a good example. Maybe like esports can probably be a sport. You can debate that as well, but it could not be an idrott because it's a lot to do with the sort of the physical component about moving around by your own force, so to say, like using the body to move around, physical exertion. It's more emphasized in idrott than in sport. Sport is more maybe about competing, or we have Noel, for example. You could talk about this, I guess, but yes, something like that.
If I may comment on that, Janne Wikström. Yeah, and I think it's also part of the national romantic movement in the 19th century and the Scandinavians. You started talking about sports in English and also in continental languages, but I think I read some etymological studies sometimes. In the 19th century, Sweden, Norway, Denmark took it actually from Icelandic, but it had gotten it from like Proto-Scandinavian, like some close to arbete, really, and that's work. So in a way, there's just as you implicated, it's not that playful. Idrott is serious business.
Yeah, and I mean, work in that sense was probably a lot about moving around in the landscape. So
Yeah, we have time for 2 more short ones, and
thank you very much. And I also want to pick up on Daniel's, if I'm allowed to say, provocation, because I think it is very provocative to think with your question actually and with your presentation between the trail path, because heritage has this idea of mediating issues. I mean, we say preserve, but we actually mean transform. And the way you presented the idea of path and trail is, for me, exactly the issue, because if we want to actually be loyal to the idea of a path that transforms on, you know, a cycle of seasons, there is the summer path, the winter path. If we're talking about shepherds, let's say, I mean, it varies according to the weather and so on. And that's the typical course of things, that paths remain. And as you began with the poem, you know, sometimes it is abandoned. And that's how, I mean, if we have to be very loyal to the idea of the path, then we need to let them go, you know. And when and if we do actually take the heritage aspect so to the extreme, then we now have to transform all the paths in the world to trails, adding signs, making them, you know, kind of with structures and with things, and so that would betray the intangible aspect of the path. And so in a way the choices are very, very hard. And I think that what comes from your paper for me is the fact that we have to make choices between not good or bad, but with different kind of stakes that are invested in both of them. Yeah, that's just how I understand it. I don't know if it's a question. I mean, it is a question. That's
But thank you for a very good comment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, of course. So I don't want to be the one who works with this in that way. So we'll leave it to someone else. But I think like what part of the pressing issue is that if we don't do anything, then all paths will probably be gone soon. So. Yeah.
I remember when we started this collaboration, Sverker said a couple of times that why are there no museums of paths?
Yeah.
And I was a bit at unease about that question, because I don't want museums of paths. I don't know what good that would make. Maybe I don't know what you think.
Yeah?
Short one and short one.
Okay, I'll try. So Danny has really helpfully connected with what I was trying to think about and what I wanted to try and say and ask. So you mentioned the ship at the end, right? And I was racking my brain because I knew that that ship metaphor was a metaphor for epistemology, but I couldn't remember who it was, and I've just checked online. It's a chap called Neurath that popularized, I think it was Quinn's book, where they talk about the ship being about truth, basically, and knowledge. And you have to, scientists and philosophers are on this ship, and they're having to constantly rebuild it using the materials they've got. They're not allowed to go to port. And that's quite a sort of coherentist model of truth and knowledge. And what I was interested in was because earlier on you shared that quote from, I can't remember the chap's name, Olander?
Yeah.
Which was religiously based, which comes from a kind of foundational metaphor of truth and knowledge. You know, everything's built on solid fact, you know, whereas the latter metaphor you used was more relational and process driven. So I was wondering, as you were sort of pointing out, it's like, that what does that mean then for the future of paths? Because if we've moved from a very static understanding or a firm, definite truth and of what a path is, you know, and what we understand a path to be, and then it's turned into a more process kind of driven, changeable thing, then yeah, I think I'm just back to you, like, well, what next then, or what do we decide to do? Because I don't know where I'm going with that. Does that make sense? Yeah. I was just really fascinated by the connection. I just thought, oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Just wondering what you think. What's next? Like, what do we do next? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
That's a very good question. Yes.
We need to keep on our thinking about this.
Yeah, we need more research funding then. No, but yeah, excellent reflection, of course, and I think that's the challenging part of it, that you have both kinds of dimensions in a way that needs to be taken into consideration, and it's quite difficult to balance. So I'm not entirely sure where I stand in this as well.
Because there's a danger of becoming really nihilistic.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
like, oh well, they're just going to exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you have to sort of, there isn't, the care is born out of
Yeah.
knowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes care is about letting go. I mean, think of children, you know? You care by actually letting them do the thing.
In heritage, they see also co-creation, so they're moving more and more towards the dynamic
Yeah.
co-create, participatory dimension for cultural heritage. I confess that I wanted to ask the same question that we asked initially: should all paths be preserved? Because also in the digital world, there is something called digital oblivion, so the right to be forgotten. So we said we do not have to preserve everything, so we can let go. But in heritage, not every in heritage. Sorry. Yeah, my voice hits a bit gone now. So I was just talking about co-creation, participatory action, participatory research in cultural heritage, working closely with local communities, as suggested by the Faro Convention, and moving from a top-down management of heritage, not just sites, but artifacts, processes, to a much more bottom-up, localized movement. And no, I don't think that everything needs to be preserved, but who decides? So who decides what we preserve or not? You both mentioned, depending on the historical period, on the needs of particular stakeholders, of all sorts of circumstances. Sometimes heritage is preserved and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, very good reflection, and I think that's again like the democratic aspect of it, that we won't be able to solve all the issues or escape all the problems around these kinds of definitions, but the more people who are involved in deciding, the better. Because if you leave it to just a few, it's history shows what can happen then. So.
Yeah, so final question, comment from OT.
Thank you, Daniel and Katarina. I think my comment was already a little bit said. It was about this care, actually, and because you mentioned this everyday maintenance and care and repair, and I was thinking, so what would that look like, and does it relate to what the paths were used for, and how, because you were also talking about the indoors and how the sports has been changing, but is it also how our ways of using the paths and how they were made, and what type of care or maintenance, what would we kind of be caring for or repairing or maintaining? I liked what Danny said about the children and young people. Does it relate to who do we get to use the paths? But maybe that was just a comment.
Well, thank you. That's also a very good comment and reflection. And I mean, about the care, I guess I'm thinking partly about the very sort of everyday kind of care in, for example, just moving a fallen tree, cutting a branch that's growing across the path, just sort of maintaining it in order to be able to keep on using it. At least that's part of the kind of care. When it comes to caring for the more immaterial aspects of a path or a trail, that's more complicated, of course, but that's also perhaps more interesting. How do we do that?
I think we need to wrap up this session now. We're a bit over time, but did you have a very short, super short? Yes.
I couldn't help myself. I was inspired by the comments of everyone. So this discussion reminded me of what Rem Koolhaas, the architect, said that too much protection may destroy a city, which I think it's what is happening to Venice, for example. This, how to say, a resistance to change and for the citizen not being able to respond to the contemporary needs because of the limitations. And it's also happening in my own country, in Ohrid, but also in Slovenia, in Bled, where we have this overprotectiveness, not only in architectural context, but if we take, for example, the Lake of Bled, it's overpopulated by tourists, and there are very strong restrictions about what can be done or not. So let me switch to the design-oriented or future-oriented perspective of what I've heard and what it inspired within me. When you were showing the images, I was thinking about, again, this question, where is the limit of letting go in the taking of care about something? And the limit of taking action, how to preserve it, but not to suffocate it, like not to overprotect it as a child, but to give a life on its own. And I would say that the most beautiful example that came to my mind is this path on the hill opposite of Acropolis in Athens, if you have ever been there. It's by Dimitris Pikionis. And when you're walking, you have the feeling like it has always been there. So it's done somewhere in the 60s or 70s. And this man, he was an architect. He was 70 years old. And he was making plans about how the path would look like, but he was never following them. So he was always saying to the people who were working with him, the nature will tell it to us, or the stones will make themselves known. And when you're walking there, it's beautiful because it's silent. So it's like a celebration of the Acropolis. It's far away from that. I mean, he also designed this path on the Acropolis, but this one is even more beautiful because it's something special. It seems like it's born from the landscape. It brings you into connection with the, how to say, mythical aspects of Greece, also with its Christian and Byzantine background, but also all the elements that are on the ground are actually taken from remnants that were taken from the ruins from the war. So it's like, I don't know, it also reminded me, like an explicit example of when you mentioned at the beginning this, the illusion of the limit between culture and nature. So it's not architecture, it's something like landscape, but a very gentle kind of landscape. Just a comment. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It brought so much things into my mind and heart. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and you're very right, Victoria. It puts a lot of thoughts into all our minds, I think. So please join me in a thank you to Katarina and Daniel. Now, some very important art announcements. You probably already figured out that there are lots of art things going on at Hannaholmen.